Welcome.
Hey, this is Kevin Shinnick, writer of Star Wars Force Collector.
I'm Cameron Scott, one of the story architects of Star Wars The High Republic.
This is Dominic Pace, who plays Gekko the Bounty Hunter from The Mandalorian.
Hi, I'm Claudia Gray. I write Star Wars books.
And you're listening.
And you are listening.
And you are listening
to Star Wars Comics in Canon. The Force is strong with this one.
Hello there and welcome to Star Wars Comics in Canon, your guide to the wider Star Wars canon through the comic book lens. And to take you on this journey, I'm your host, Mike Burton. And so brings another High Republic book review. Well, technically this is an audio drama, but I'm going to structure it very similarly to the way I structure my book reviews, so be prepared for that. Hello friends, thank you so much for tuning in as always. Just to give you an overview of what's going on, so the Battle of Jedha by George Mann is the focus of this episode. What I'm going to do is give you my spoiler-free thoughts on this audio drama / book, however you want to kind of think about it, but I did listen to the audio drama, but I do have the script book in front of me for reference. Now this is part of the High Republic. Now I've tackled all other High Republic content in Phase 1, and so we are into Phase 2 now. So Phase 2 is a prequel. It's set around 150 years before the High Republic Phase 1 era, and the Phase 1 era of the High Republic is set around 200 years before the Skywalker Saga, so before the Phantom Menace. Now, if you're on YouTube, you can go into the playlist and it's got all my High Republic content there. I've tackled every comic, the audio drama, and also I've done book reviews for all 9 books, as well as the Starlight stories, which are some short stories as well. Plus, I've also tackled the manga, and I'm going to be doing that for Phase 2 as well. And so far, I have done the book reviews for the first wave, which is Path of Deceit, Quest for the Hidden City, and Convergence. Now I'm doing the Battle of Jedha, and then in the future, I'll be doing the next wave of books, which is going to be Cataclysm, Quest for Planet X, and Path of Vengeance. Now, before I delve into the Wave 2 stuff, so Cataclysm and etc., I will be tackling some of the Wave 1 comics. The Battle of Jedha seems to kind of sit in between Wave 1 and Wave 2, so each phase has generally got waves just to kind of block things off a little bit, just so you're not, bombarded with 9 books in one go. You normally have 3 to 6 months between each wave, and then they're kind of a collection of things that happen around the same time. So Path of Deceit, Quest for the Hidden City, and Convergence, as well as the first 5 of the High Republic comics by Marvel, written by Cavan Scott, as well as the first 3 or 4 High Republic Adventures comics by Daniel Jose Older, published by Dark Horse. They all happen around the same time, and then the subsequent issues and subsequent books happen after that. Now, I do this show so you don't have to pick up every single piece of Star Wars content, be it the comics or books or anything like that. So that's the general idea. I'll go through the plot details, and then along the way I give you a bit of extra information on certain characters or species or planets or events that connect with the wider Star Wars canon. In this scenario, some is going to be within the High Republic era, some is going to be outside of the High Republic era. With the book reviews, generally it's more my thoughts on these things and giving you a good plot overview, but I will give you spoilers before I get into that, whereas the comics is much more about the plot details and those sorts of things. So this is going to serve as a book review, but also as an overview. So if you don't have time to pick up the Battle of Jedha audiobook, or you don't want to read the script book, this serves as a good placeholder for that. But I will always say to people, support the creators, support the High Republic Initiative, support every element of Star Wars really. Try and pick up the comics or the audiobooks or whatever where you can. I always encourage people to do that, but obviously I still appreciate people listening to the show who haven't consumed all of that content. Now, to make this episode the best, I would recommend either reading the High Republic books. I'd say Path of Deceit and Convergence are a must, and then Quest for the Hidden City is also helpful, but you don't have to have read any of those if you have listened to my episodes on them, because I'll give you the general overview in those episodes. So if you want to go back and listen to those episodes, if you haven't already read the books, the Path of Deceit was the first one, that was out 7th of January, Quest for the Hidden City was out the 5th of February, and then Convergence was out the 18th of March. To clarify, those are the times that I released the episodes reviewing said books. So I think that's a good overview of what you can expect from listening to this episode, so let's just delve right in. So the Battle of Jedha, it is an audio drama, so it is written in a way so it could be performed by a full voice cast with sound effects and music and all that sort of thing, so I would recommend that that's the best way to consume this piece of content. That was released January 3rd, 2023, and then the script book was released February 14th, 2023. And I will warn people both with this and other audio dramas, including The Tempest Runner from Phase 1 of the High Republic, Dooku Jedi Lost by Cavan Scott that loosely links to the High Republic, and the Dr. Aphra audio drama, because of all of those those are released as audio dramas, when you get the book, it's not written like a normal book, it's written like a script. So some people find that harder to read. I personally do as well, so I always opt to listen to the audio dramas the way they were kind of made, but you can pick up the script book and it is readable. It's just generally not the easiest format. And the audio drama itself is around 5 hours long, which may sound long if you haven't really been listening to audiobooks and things, but as a point of reference, the majority of the High Republic books in audiobook format, at least the adult versions of them, they are normally between like 10 and 15 hours, so it's actually quite short in comparison. Now, although it is quite short, it is very important, I'd say, to the High Republic. Now, I will say that the comics kind of tell a very similar story to what's going on here. The comics, especially the High Republic comics, published by Marvel, written by Canon Scott, they work very, very well with the Battle of Jedha. I think, although I mentioned you should read the other books and things, those are probably the most important piece of printed content to consume before delving into this. I would say very close second to that would be Convergence. There's a lot of political intrigue about Convergence, which is basically the reason a lot of the Jedi are on Jedha at this time, but all of the books do connect together. So, I love consuming all the High Republic content because it all connects together, but it can be quite daunting for some people. So let's start with my spoiler-free thoughts on this audio drama. I do really enjoy it. I think I enjoyed this one more than I enjoyed The Tempest Runner, which is from Phase 1. I did enjoy The Tempest Runner. I didn't do a standalone episode on that. I just kind of fed into my The Rising Storm review, but The Tempest Runner kind of felt like an add-on. It was following Lorna D, which is one of the main Nihil leaders, and although it was interesting and I enjoyed it, it definitely did not feel very necessary. It felt like one of the pieces of the High Republic content that someone could easily not consume and not read, and it wouldn't really affect the whole story. There's only like 1 or 2 characters that die in it, and they're not very major characters either, so with that I found that it was a bit, not lackluster. Canon Scott's writing was great, the audio drama itself was performed brilliantly, but I didn't find it was that necessary. The Battle of Jedha, however, I find is a lot more important. What happens in this audio drama really does affect the future of the High Republic, or it really affects the book Cataclysm, because Convergence and Cataclysm are sequels to each other, but Battle of Jedha fits right on in there. So if you are a fan of the adult books, I'd really recommend that. Cataclysm by Lydia Kang has just come out, so I've got a copy of that now, and a nice signed Goldsboro version, so I'm very chuffed about that. And obviously Convergence by Zoraida Cordova, that is a fantastic book as well that I really recommend. You can go check out my book review of that. And to clarify, people listening may be going, what's the difference between an audiobook and an audio drama? Audio drama is made like Battle of Jedha is, specifically with voice actors, and it's made to be a audio drama. An audio book is just someone reading out a book, essentially. The Star Wars audiobooks normally get voice actors such as Jonathan Davis or Mark Thompson to read them, and they can do a whole host of voices, so it does feel like there's a bit more of a cast, and also all the Star Wars audiobooks always has Star Wars music behind it and sound effects and that sort of thing. So the Star Wars audiobooks lean a little bit more on audio dramas than a standard book would, but again, they are slightly different. Everyone's got their own preferences. I quite listening to Star Wars Legends books on audiobook, while I quite reading canon books physically, but that's just me. So the Battle of Jedha itself, it's split into 5 parts. I won't name them quite yet because there's a very minor spoiler, I think, from that, so I'll get into that in my next kind of part of the review. But in short, I really enjoyed this audio drama. I definitely preferred it to The Tempest Runner, and I feel like this is really important for people to read, and I found that the characters really interesting. I felt that the way it connected with all the other books prior, Path of Deceit, Quest for the Hidden City, and Convergence, all worked really, really well. It meant that I didn't have to pick up those things, but because I'm a completionist with the High Republic, I did, and there's certain characters that pop up, but I found that when the characters did pop up, it wasn't this big mystery of who they were. There was like a line of dialogue here or there where they were like, oh yeah, I'm so-and-so, oh, where's your Padawan? Oh, they're off doing this, because of that thing that we did. It's that kind of idea. So you do get a gist of things. You're not like left out if you haven't read all the other pieces of content. But if you have read the other content, you're like, oh yeah, it's so-and-so. So I quite enjoyed that. Now, this book focuses on a variety of characters. So one of the main ones is Creighton's son, and you can actually see him on the cover of this book along with Ada Forte. Now, Creighton's son, he was in Convergence, and he is one of the secondary characters, I'd say, in Convergence. And then Ada Forte, from what I can see, she hasn't really been in the High Republic elsewhere. This is kind of her main debut. So they're both on the cover. Creighton's son is the human, whereas Ada Forte is a Nikto. And she is a Kadassa Nikto, so she's green-skinned, and there are generally 3 types of Nikto, and they're all from slightly different regions. They usually have slightly different colorings and things, but she's a green one. Another character that shows up is Salandra Sho. Now, she is from Quest for the Hidden City. If you've seen any of the concept art for the High Republic Phase 2, then you will have seen a Jedi with a shield. She is that Jedi with a shield. She's a very interesting character, and I really like her interactions here with Creighton and with Ada as well. Now, the general premise of this is going to be a mild spoiler for Convergence, is it's about Erano and Aram. So both of these planets are always at war, essentially, and then they come to an agreement where they'll sign a peace treaty, and that happens in the Battle of Jedha. So this peace treaty is trying to be signed while there's also something going on called the Festival of Balance, which is inside the Season of Light. Now, Jedha is meant to be this kind of safe haven for any people who believe in almost any religion to do with the Force. So you've got like the Guardians of the Wills there, which we saw on Jedha in Rogue One. We saw Chirrut Imwe and Baze Malbus. But you've got other members of different religions. You've got the Church of the Force, which is supported by the San Tekkas. Now, Lor San Tekka, who's in The Force Awakens right at the start, who gives that piece of the map to Poe Dameron, and he also features in the Poe Dameron comics quite a bit, he was a member of the Church of the Force. Generally, people who are those members are people who are not Force sensitive, but they believe in the Force and the light side and those sorts of things. There's a couple of dark side followers on Jedha as well, and there's a variety of different people. I'm not just going to list them all here, but it's quite interesting having all these kind of different perspectives on the Force and them all trying to live in harmony. And they have this council where they all talk about their different perceptions of the Force and how they can kind of pull together in the galaxy to make things all work out. So Jedha's a really interesting place for that. And a lot of people who are Force sensitive, or a lot who aren't Force sensitive, like to do a pilgrimage there. So they go to Jedha, they meditate in places, they go on like long walks and things. It's a really, really interesting place. So when the Battle of Jedha is taking place, you've got all these festivals, all these different religions and all these kind of things all combining together, plus a peace treaty trying to be signed and everything else. So tensions get very high. Now, obviously, because the book is called The Battle of Jedha, it does somewhat spoil it immediately what's actually going to happen. It wouldn't be the most exciting book, and it would be a bit of misinformation if no battle ever occurred on Jedha. So that does happen. In this book as well are members of the Path of the Open Hand. Now, the Path of the Open Hand were first in Path of Deceit, which is an absolutely phenomenal book. Now, I've enjoyed all the High Republic books, but I think the Path of Deceit might be my favourite High Republic book. It's very, very close, if not the same as The Rising Storm, which was my favourite. It's quite hard to tell, which means I'm even more excited for Path of Vengeance, because Path of Vengeance is like a sequel to Path of Deceit and is written by Cavan Scott. Path of Deceit was written by Tessa Gratton and Justina Ireland, and The Rising Storm was written by Cavan Scott. So for me, Path of Vengeance is kind of combining elements of my two favourite Star Wars High Republic books so far, and hopefully making something even better. So I'm very, very excited about Path of Vengeance, but this review isn't about Path of Vengeance, because that doesn't come out for another month. But the Path of the Open Hand are essentially a group, or a religious group, a sect, a cult, however one wants to define them, a group of people who believe that the Force should be free. That's a very common phrase they say, and if anyone was at Star Wars Celebration, they'd have heard people saying the Force will be free. Now, the reason for this is none of them are Force sensitive, and there's a lot of theories as to why they all kind of believe that I'm not going to delve into here, but in short, they believe that if a Jedi, for example, manipulates and uses the Force, by using a Force push or Force pull or, jumping ridiculously high or things like that, anytime someone uses the Force, they count that as a manipulation of the Force. They kind of view the light side and the dark side as basically the same thing, and they think that even if you do something in a good way and, say, save someone's life from it, it means that it takes away some of the power the Force has somewhere else. So it's kind of that idea that the Force only has like a limited reach. If you perceive it as, say, a living being, probably a good metaphor for this would be Superman. If you're asking Superman to go and help like a cat out of a tree, that's a time where he can't be going and helping, say, 20 people from a burning building. It's that kind of idea of the Path of the Open Hand, where they think any time a Jedi is forcibly using the Force, then it means that the Force can't help someone else in the universe, and that's what the Force should be able to do. Hence why the Force will be free. No one who touches the Force uses it. You can get visions from the Force, and there's a couple of little loopholes, shall we say, that members of the Path of the Open Hand like to exploit, but their kind of MO, their objective is to try and stop Force users from using the Force and trying to show to the rest of the galaxy that it can be dangerous. In addition to that, you've got the San Tekka clan, and then you've also got the Grafs. So both the San Tekka and the Grafs are two of the richest families, especially in this era of the High Republic, because they are responsible for the hyperspace lanes. So in hyperspace, you can't just travel somewhere using hyperspace without any navigational equipment or anything like that. So a hyperspace lane is kind of like a motorway or a highway. So imagine if you've got this big open field, you could go, oh yeah, I could drive a car through there, and you probably could. But it's not quite the same driving a car through like a bumpy up and down field as it would be if someone put a motorway with tarmac through the middle of that. It's that kind of idea. It's kind of a hyperspace lane is meant to kind of prove a route is safe and it is quite a quick way to go. That's generally how hyperspace lanes work without just delving really, really far into it. But explanations on the hyperspace stuff, I've kind of talked about it a little bit in a lot of my High Republic content because it's quite a key theme within the High Republic, especially because the High Republic is this age of exploration, especially Phase 2. And keeping in line with what Convergence was like, there's a lot of sort of political maneuvering in this book. There's a lot of people who don't like others because of one reason or another, and then trying to kind of either attack them or put them down without trying to do it in an overt way. And that's a lot of what happens here as well. Now, I found the characters themselves in this book were really, really interesting. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and hearing lots of different voices was really interesting too. As I said, I always read the High Republic books physically, so I don't really get to hear their voices very much. I've heard like bits and pieces, and obviously I listened to the audio drama of The Tempest Runner, so I heard a lot there. And people like Mark Thompson have done an incredible job of voicing members of the High Republic, doing Skier and things like that, which he's quite famous for, and Marchion Rowe. But when you have a whole voice cast being able to do it, it really helps to find those voices a bit more, because one thing I found from some of the Legends audiobooks, for example, is when you have two characters who sound somewhat similar and there's a conversation going between them, if you're just listening, it can be a little bit tricky at times to work out who's saying what. But when you have completely different voice actors playing them, it makes it far easier to define who is speaking. So yeah, the characters are really good. I like how there's characters from each of the books, the junior, young adult and adult novels, all kind of interacting and stuff. I always like those kind of things. You've got some new characters, which are really cool, that I'll delve into in a little bit. You've got all of these different force sects together. You've got a lot of political maneuvering. So plot-wise, this is brilliant. There's a lot of really interesting parts to it. I will say that the start of it I found was a little bit slow. They do the thing where they kind of count down to when the battle starts, which is not dissimilar to the way the Light of the Jedi worked with the emergence or the Great Disaster happening. But I found that there was a lot of kind of meandering. It was obviously setting the scene, so I appreciate there wasn't a real easy way to do this, and I think George Mann did a fantastic job of writing this, and obviously writing a script book is quite different from writing a normal book. But I did just find the first part, because I said it was split into 5 parts, the first part was quite slow. It took a little while to get going, but once things started to happen, I mean, the very first chapter, or like the prologue thing, is like an event that happens, and then it doesn't actually happen until later on in the book, so it is kind of that little thing of teasing you, being like, oh, this is going to happen, but let's show how we got there. So I do like that, and I wasn't ever bored at any point, and there were points where I was trying to find excuses to be able to listen to this audio drama, especially when I got like halfway through. Like Megan would go to bed, and I'd be like, oh, I'll just do all the washing up, I'll clean the kitchen, and I'd just spend like an hour or two doing it just so I could listen to this audio drama. So I really, really enjoyed it. I want to clarify that. I found that the plot was really interesting, and there were a surprising amount of sort of twists and turns. As I said, one of the issues I had with The Tempest Runner is it felt somewhat inconsequential. I didn't feel that really anything that happened in The Tempest Runner was that important to the wider plot, whereas I found that what happens in this book is a lot more important. And I found that there are characters who are in danger, and there are characters who can die, whereas because The Tempest Runner was focusing on this villain, in a sense, without really any main characters in it, I was like, well, I don't think they're going to kill one of the main villains in their own book, so that kind of took it away. And then the rest of the characters in The Tempest Runner I wasn't quite as interested by, whereas because the Battle of Jedha, so many characters are from so many different places, I found there definitely was a degree of dramatic tension there, which is what you want in a book like this. I thought the sound engineering is fantastic again. I mean, audiobooks from Star Wars always have really, really good production quality, but the fact this was an audio drama, it was even better. The sound effects were great, and there's a couple of moments where like someone gets punched really hard or thrown into a wall and you hear a crunch, and it's intense. It reminds me a little bit of the Darth Bane trilogy of books, the audiobooks of those, because there are points where Bane like uses a force push and you hear like this horrible crunching noise, and the description is like their insides were like crushed down or liquidized. So it's like, okay, that's quite a lot to deal with, and I think that the audio drama really did that quite well as well. So yeah, I thought the pacing was great, the story was great, the characters are really interesting. Like, I really, really enjoyed this. I think that if I was ranking this along with the other books of the High Republic, if I just stick to Phase 2, I think Path of Deceit is still the best, then it's closely followed by Convergence, and then I think it's Battle of Jedha. I think that this is better, or at least more enjoyable for me, than Quest for the Hidden City. In my review of Quest for the Hidden City, I said it was really good, I did enjoy it, but it was kind of slow in places, and the story felt quite small in size, which I'm not necessarily opposed to. It just didn't quite grab me in the other way, especially because in Phase 1 I absolutely adored the junior novels. So I did find that the Battle of Jedha, was more enjoyable than Quest for the Hidden City, but it's interesting because both this and Quest for the Hidden City are both written by George Mann. So I'm really interested to see what George Mann's got lined up for us in Phase 3 of the High Republic, and I was lucky enough to be at Star Wars Celebration, and they revealed all the titles and things for the books, and who's writing them and when they're coming out, that sort of thing. So I'm very excited for George Mann's. I think he's got an adult book coming, because I found that his Quest for the Hidden City was good, but it wasn't like amazing, whereas the Battle of Jedha, because it felt a bit more adult and he kind of had a bit more freedom to tackle some more adult themes, I really enjoyed that element more. So I'm very excited to see what George Mann comes out with when he has a bit more freedom to write with, without the parameters of, say, an audio drama or of a junior novel. So I think that's a pretty good way of giving my spoiler-free thoughts. I think I've covered generally the timeline, where things are set, and some opinions on stuff, and how it kind of connects to the wider content. So now I'm going to delve a little bit more into spoilery territory. So I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about some of the characters and things, and generally what happens in the plot in a bit more detail as well. And I'll try and keep it to the first few chapters, or maybe the first like half an hour to an hour of the audio drama itself. So if anyone is intending on listening or reading the script book, you still have the opportunity without spoilers, then I will give a major spoiler warning, and then that'll be me giving you the whole plot overview and a bit more details and stuff, and some of the elements I did and didn't enjoy as much, which I can only talk about if I basically spoil it. So this is your minor spoiler warning. As I said, I won't delve too much into the plot details and things. It will just be in the first small portion of the book. And then when I've done with this minor spoiler part, I will then read out the blurb, or the publisher's summary as it's called. And then after that, I'll give you my major spoiler warning, and then I'll delve into the plot. So minor spoiler thoughts. You have a new character called Keth Serapath, who I really enjoyed listening to and delving into. So they are an adjunct at the Kyber Temple, and they are assisting Morton Santeca, who is the mediator for the peace treaty signed by Erano and Aram. Now, Keth Serapath, you get a lot from his perspective, which I really enjoy. He's got a cool droid companion, which I quite like as well, and his droid companion only speaks in proverbs. And I found that quite peculiar to begin with, but then I think as the audience we're meant to kind of understand it as the book kind of unfolds, you get about a third through it, and then you realise that the proverbs are not only really cool and very well written, but also they do actually make sense a lot of the time, and there's like in subtext. So it'll be things like, oh hey B3, his name is B3, the droid I should say, and it's like, oh hey B3, do you want to come with me? And then it's like, through the Force, everyone can see the way. And you're like, what? But Keth understands that means yes, I would like to come. It's like a positive thing. So there's lots of elements like that. And then there's bits where it'll be like, oh no, you've done this wrong. And then he'll say things like, only through the Force can one stop being lost. You know, kind of things like that. I'm explaining it terribly, but if you read the script book or the audio drama, you would have an understanding of like the proverbs of the droid B3. I found to be really interesting. It's very clever. It's like on the nose kind of dialogue, but I did enjoy that. And so, as I said, he's part of the Kyber Temple, which is linked with the Guardians of the Whills. So the Guardians of the Whills, as I said, you've got Chirrut Imwe and Baz Malbus from Rogue One. They were members of the Guardians of the Whills, and they are maybe like slightly Force sensitive, but they are more aligned with sort of monks, where, you know, Jedi are much more overt with their Force power use, whereas the monks, a lot of the time, they meditate a lot more, they kind of listen to the Force a bit more. Yeah, they may be able to fight a bit better just because they have got a degree of Force sensitivity and connection, but they're not as upfront about it all as the Jedi are. And I don't think that the Guardians of the Whills have to specifically be Force sensitive. I think you just have to be open to the idea of the Force and very, very disciplined. Because in the comics as well, there's a character that is linked with the Guardians of the Whills as well, and they are not disciplined and they get thrown out. So the Guardians of the Whills, I think, are a lot more strict about these things. So I just wanted to tell you what the 6 parts of this audio drama are called. So part 1 is Pilgrim, part 2 is Fallout, part 3 is Unbalanced, part 4 is Outbreak, part 5 is Reckoning, and part 6 is Salvation. So the reason I put this in the slightly spoilery section is because obviously just the names of those kind of give you an idea of when certain elements will happen. Now, another part of this book that I really liked, which is a bar called Enlightenment. It's meant to be an impartial bar on Jedha, and the owner is called Craden, not to be confused with Creighton, who's Creighton's son, the Jedi Master. This is Craden with a K and with a D as well. His full name is Craden Minced, and he is a Villarandi, which is an insectoid kind of species. It seems to have been created for the High Republic, and there don't seem to be any other characters of this species, but he speaks very oddly in the audio drama. It is somewhat grating when you hear it, and it was a little bit confusing hearing people refer to Craden and thinking they meant Creighton. But yeah, he is the owner of Enlightenment. So this bar called Enlightenment is very interesting. It features in the comics a little bit as well, but it's this guy, Creighton, I say guy, he's like an alien species thing, where he just lets anyone in as long as no one causes trouble. So it's meant to be like a neutral space on Jedha, especially because of the tensions, shall we say, of the various religious sects, which seems to be getting worse and worse and worse. And then when the peace treaty gets signed and they go there to do that, then it gets even more heightened. Now, from the Path of the Open Hand, you've got the character Marda Rowe, who was in Path of Deceit. She's a very interesting character, and she is like the new favourite, shall we say, of the 2 heads of the Path of the Open Hand, who are the Mother and the Herald. Now, what this book does very well is you've got lots of different intertwining plots kind of sewing themselves together. Obviously, at the start, it seems like they're not specifically connected, but then one group of people will do one thing, and then you'll see another group of people kind of respond to that thing without knowing that that said group of people kind of did it, if you know what I mean. And so it does that quite a lot, and I think that the way it's written, again, it really works. It really fits together, and I didn't really feel very confused at points of what was actually going on, which I really appreciated because I find in audiobooks/audio dramas that can happen, especially in action scenes. Another element I really enjoyed about this is the different perspectives. I touched upon it early on in this episode, but basically where you've got so many different believers of the Force, it's really interesting hearing all of their kind of perspectives on why certain things are happening and who to blame in a lot of ways. Now again, the comics really help this because there's certain things that are referenced in this audio drama which you actually get to see in the comics. One of them is a group called the Convergence of the Force. So they're basically like a council kind of put together from various Force religions. So you've got the Jedi on there, you've got the Disciplines of the Wills, the Guardians of the Wills, the Church of the Force, the Sorcerers of Tund, and then a few here which, thanks to Wikipedia, because I wasn't specifically aware of, the Falanasi, the Lonto, and the Matakai. So lots of different people who believe in the Force, and in the comics it shows that the Herald, one of the members of the Path of the Open Hand, tries to join the Convocation, even though the Path of the Open Hand are very much against using the Force, whereas all of these individuals are people who use the Force, or at least study it or are okay with others using the Force. So there's a lot of tension there between the Path of the Open Hand and the Convocation. Another element of discourse is again the Arano-Aram thing. So I mentioned it prior, but in short, you've got a forever war that was going on between Aram and Arano, and then this is a spoiler for Convergence. There is a peace treaty that gets agreed, and therefore they're trying to sign this peace treaty in essence. And so they try and sign it on Jedha, but ambassadors from both sides are not overly happy about it, but they kind of go along with things. And then one of the first signings ends up getting bombed, and one of the ambassadors gets killed, and then it's even more, like tensions get worse and worse because, you know, the Aram are blaming Arano, and Arano is blaming Aram, and then they've actually got forces in orbit, and then they send those down to attack. So the Battle of Jedha not only has Aram and Arano fighting each other, while also having the Path of the Open Hand pulling certain strings and whatnot, while you've got lots of Force sensitives trying to hold down the forts in a sense, while you've got rioting in the streets from the inhabitants of Jedha, and loads of other kind of things culminating together. It's basically just a big mess. It's a very coherent mess narrative-wise, but being there on the streets of Jedha, which is really what it feels like when you listen to this audio drama, it is a mess. So there's political intrigue in this, there's like religious intrigue in this, there's some brilliant action scenes, there's lots of cool new characters, there's some returning characters or ones that haven't really had their time to shine in things. Really, really interesting elements. So I think that draws to a close of the mild spoilery part of this review. I will just read the publisher's summary, also known as the blurb, and then after that I'll give you a major spoiler warning, and then I'll give you my full, unfiltered thoughts on this audio drama, as well as the plot itself, so be aware of that. So here is the publisher's summary. Jedha. The worn streets of this ancient world serve as a confluence for the galaxy, visited by all, yet owned by none. Here, the Jedi are but one creed among many worshipping and studying the Force. From the Guardians of the Wills to the Path of the Open Hand, countless beings come to learn and to share in peace. As all of Jedha prepares for its festival of balance, the galaxy still reels from the violence on Aram and Arano. But after foiling a plot to escalate a war between the two planets, the Jedi believe that a lasting peace may be within reach. Master Creighton's son and the Jedi Knight, Ada Forte, arrive on Jedha with delegations from both planets to formally end the Forever War. The Jedi hope that the harmony of Jedha's many factions, along with the signing of a peace treaty, will create a symbol to the rest of the galaxy of what can be accomplished through unity. But not all are happy with the Jedi's involvement, all ready to concern themselves with peace. Rumours begin to swirl that the Jedi are bringing the war in their wake. The distrust and anger that for so long fueled the Forever War now threatens to corrupt the communities of Jedha. When violence breaks out on the Sacred Moon, the war that was meant to end on Jedha may soon engulf the entire world. So that is the publisher's summary. I've also realised that there is actually an opening crawl. I had a look through my script book and couldn't immediately see it, and that's because there's a prologue and then it's the opening crawl. So there is an opening crawl. I'm not going to read it here, just so you know, you can find it online and things, but it's generally just kind of what I explained earlier on in this, so I would somewhat be repeating myself. It just gives a summary of the events of Convergence and that general thing, and who's going to be there, the characters that I have already named. Here is your spoiler warning. I'm now going to be talking about the rest of the audio drama. I'm going to be talking about it in full. There are going to be spoilers ahead, and I'm just giving my full, somewhat unfiltered thoughts, so you have been warned. And I must apologise, I sound really bunged up because I partially recorded this the other day and I'm partially recording it today, as I often do, and a cold has hit me quite badly, so apologies that I sound quite bunged up and nasally. So one element I want to mention is characters. So you've got Creighton's son and Ada Forte, who are two of the main characters in this. Both of them were actually first in Convergence. I think I might have earlier on said Ada wasn't in Convergence. She is, but briefly from what I can recall. But both of those are the main characters, and they're really interesting. They've got quite an interesting dynamic, like a good back and forth. And then you've also got Salandra Show, who was in Quest for the Hidden City. Now, I could pretty much tell from the get-go, Salandra Show wasn't going to die, because you don't introduce a character in a junior novel and then kill them off in an adult audio drama. That's just not very fair, is it? Also, creating like the first canon Jedi character with a shield and making her so cool, it would be a shame to kill her off so quickly, so she is certainly going to have more substantial stuff to do, I imagine, in the junior novel Quest for Planet X, or maybe she's going to be appearing in some of the other books as well. As I said, I have not yet started reading the following High Republic books, just because I try and get these reviews down before I start reading other content most of the time, just because otherwise it starts to kind of merge together a little bit. So I didn't think Salandra Show was going to die. I didn't think Creighton's son was going to die. Ada Forte I was more unsure of because she didn't have such a major role in Convergence. I was like, oh, maybe she will, maybe she won't. Who really knows? And then you've got some of the other characters. You've got a lot of supporting characters die. Fortunately, in this battle, there's a lot of them. So you've got people like Mesuk, who is one of the Guardians of the Wills. I believe that he dies as well. And you've got quite a lot of those kind of characters that are introduced in this get killed. It's quite a safe bet. And one of those, and this is quite a big spoiler, one of those is Keth Serapath. So I mentioned him very early on, he is an adjunct at the Kyber Temple, and he gets appointed to assist the ambassador, which is San Tekka, who then gets killed at the explosion thing I mentioned earlier that I think the prologue is of, and I think you hear that in part 2, and then he gets replaced with Tilson Graff. And so Keth then becomes like an assistant to Tilson Graff. So Keth Serapath, he's an interesting character. He's quite nice, he's quite like a normal guy. A lot of his dialogue and scenes take place in the Enlightenment bar. I mentioned earlier that Enlightenment is run by a guy called Creighton, but this Keth Serapath, so I had a hunch that he was going to die in this. He has quite a nice arc, and he has quite a cool little droid that's with him, which I mentioned earlier, B3, who only speaks in like proverbs. And it's one of those things that this book, and I didn't want to mention it in the non-spoiler kind of review because in itself this opinion spoils it somewhat. But because it's an audio drama, they weren't going to kill any of the main characters from Convergence because it just wouldn't seem right. Because where the High Republic is meant to be, each piece of content you read is meant to be self-sufficient, but they also connect to a wider thing. So it does kind of pigeonhole itself where you just know certain characters who are major aren't going to die. Like, for example, Axel Greylark isn't in this book, but I knew for a fact Axel Greylark wasn't going to die in this book. I keep saying book, audio drama, same thing. Forgive me, I'm not going to keep correcting myself, but book, audio drama, whenever I say that in this, it's mean the same thing. But like, I knew he wasn't going to show up or die. And then with Creighton's son, I was like, they could, because he's like the main character, he's on the cover. Maybe he could, but just going from what the Tempest Runner had, no one really important died in the Tempest Runner. One major Nile character died, and that was it. And also in the books, it was heavily alluded to they died anyway, and then in the audio drama, it's like, oh look, they're not dead. Really? No, they are dead. I was like, oh, okay, cool. So in this, although it was really enjoyable, and there was tension for the new characters, the tension for me wasn't actually around any of the characters I liked dying. It was more about what is happening on Jedha. And there's one major event that happens on Jedha that I believe George Mann mentioned, or it might have been Cameron Scott, one of the two mentioned it at the High Republic panel at Star Wars Celebration, which was that the giant statue of a Jedi that has collapsed, you see it in Rogue One, like the wreckage of it in a sense, that falls in the Battle of Jedha. And it's actually called the Final Protector, or just the Protector. So this giant, massive, like 100, if not more, foot stone tall Jedi. It's really, really cool. And when it falls, it's quite a massive, it has a big effect on Jedha, not because it's this giant structure that's falling down, but also because what it represents and kind of the failings of a Jedi in a lot of ways, how the Jedi have fallen in a sense, because the theme it feels like in Phase 2 of the High Republic really is how can the Jedi, while trying to help, be perceived as not helping. It's kind of like a low-key version of what happened in the Clone Wars. But the Clone Wars, they were being heavily manipulated. In this, it was more so there's just this mystery and strange stuff that keeps going around, namely to do with the Nameless / the Leveler, which obviously is a big part of Phase 1, and then we're starting to see where this kind of came from in Phase 2. But that kind of element of what is making the Jedi unbalanced? What kind of things disrupts the Jedi? And how much can this group of people kind of mess with the Jedi without people really finding out? And that's a lot of what Phase 2 has been. So I liked the imagery of the final protector falling. I thought that was good, and audio-wise it sounded fantastic, and it felt like a big weighted event that occurred. And what I also like about this is that the Path of the Open Hand haven't got this one big giant plan, or at least we don't know if they do yet. Each member of the Path of the Open Hand, who are the ones who are somewhat messing with the Jedi, they each have their own agendas, like every member kind of does, and they don't all know the whole picture, apart from seemingly the mother. They all kind of have bits and pieces to go on, and a lot of the members of the Path have no idea what the Nameless is, or the Leveler as it's called, or any of this strange goings on, or any maliciousness from the Herald or the Mother, whereas a lot of the people in the inner circle, such as Marda Rowe, are aware of such things. And the Herald himself as well, he is a Nautilid who had some of his head tendrils sort of cut off. It wasn't cut off due to the Path of the Open Hand, I think it was cut off prior to that, and then it's just kind of traumatized him in a lot of ways. But basically, he ends up rallying a lot of these crowds and telling them, like, riling them up and getting them to riot. He's like a big reason for why the inhabitants of Jeddah, the normal people, the pedestrians in a sense, why they started to riot. You get to see part of it in the comics again, which works really, really well, but you also get to see it quite a lot in this audio drama. So I really, really like that element, just different people doing different things. And like the mother, for example, is she's got her own agenda, she's trying to do stuff, and she's subtly manipulating the Herald to do certain things to make him look bad so she can kind of pin the blame on him when stuff starts to go bad. So I like that element, I like the imagery in this, and I think that the weight of what happens here is really cool. The only issue I'm having a little bit with Phase 2 of the High Republic is that I'm not connecting with the characters anywhere near as much as I was in Phase 1. After reading Light of the Jedi, I think as most people were, Bel Zettifar, Loden Greatstorm, and Porter Engle were all just incredible characters that I clicked with immediately. There are other characters like Elzar Mann and Burryaga I definitely connected with a lot more from the subsequent books, but just from the get-go, they were ones that really connected to me. So when, spoiler, there's a spoiler just for like the Rising Storm, which I imagine you'd have read by this point, but Loden Greatstorm dies. And that death really felt like a huge amount of weight, especially with the perspective of Bel Zettifar from it. And so I really, really enjoyed that. And when Porter Engle inevitably dies, which I hope he never dies, I hope he lives forever, but he's like 300 years old or something at the time of Phase 1. So he's probably, I don't know how long his species live, but I don't think it's going to be like Yoda species as far as I can tell. But like certain characters, if their deaths, they're going to really, really affect me. Whereas I found that I like Creighton's son, I think he's cool, but I just find him a bit bland. Ada Forte's interesting, she's a bit more quirky, but she's not like that exciting to me. Salandra Show is intriguing because she's got the shield, but again, they're very much these mature master style kind of Jedi, and I like the ones who are either Padawans or new Jedi. I like the ones who have got some vulnerability to them. Now, Gelen Atai, who is in the Convergence book, she appears a little bit in this audio drama. She's like communicating with Creighton and Ada like back and forth a little bit occasionally, but she's not a main part of this. She's going to feature a lot more in Cataclysm. And her as a character I find a lot more intriguing because she's a bit more unbalanced. She's kind of still trying to find her way, whereas Creighton's son, for example, is really set in his ways. He's kind of developed as a person, and that's kind of him. So to counter that with the comics, you've got the Jedi Vildar Mac, who is going through some traumatic stuff. He's got like he basically gets PTSD, and you get to see in the comics quite a lot of how this PTSD is affecting him and affecting his judgment. So him as a character I find really interesting, but again, maybe it's because they're prequels, maybe it takes away, like with the High Republic, granted it is generally a prequel to the Phantom Menace and the Skywalker Saga and those sort of things because it happens 200 years before, but because it's so far removed, it's like a whole new era of people, so you do actually have the weight for them. Whereas with Phase 2, it's 150 years prior to Phase 1, so it's 350 years removed from the Skywalker Saga. And I've just not been connecting with the characters quite as much. So one character I really connected with, which I think everyone connected with, was Kevmo. And I'm going to give a slight spoiler now for Path of Deceit, which I hope you yourselves have read because it's a phenomenal book. But Kevmo dies. Unfortunately, he's basically the Loden Greatstorm, I find, of Phase 2. So he's not a master like Loden or anything like that. He's actually a Padawan, and he's just got tragedy. It's just, and I think Path of Vengeance is really going to lean on that because Path of Vengeance is obviously a sequel to Path of Deceit. But Kevmo I really, really enjoyed. I loved his character, and then he's gone. And then the junior characters I haven't found, like Rupert, I haven't found as interesting, but Salandra Show is part of the junior novel characters, so I did like her. I'm finding the non-Jedi characters in Phase 2 aren't quite as intriguing. Now, members of the Path of the Open Hand, like Marda Rowe, I find interesting. The Mother, I find interesting. The Herald, I find interesting. So all of the Path of the Open Hand, I find really interesting. A couple of dead Jedi, I find quite interesting. And then the Jedi with a shield. And then obviously Vildar Mac, who's the one who's got trauma. But The rest of them, not quite as much. Like in Convergence, when there were certain other Jedi mentioned and things, I didn't really care about most of them. Gela was the only one that really connected with me, I found. But I don't know if that's because Gela Natai, she starts to have feelings towards Axel Greylark. Now, we don't know if it's romantic feelings or what it is, but there's some degree of connection there that kind of goes beyond just the standard plutonic. It just goes beyond what she has with her peers in like a unique way. And I really like that. It makes her such an interesting character. It makes her very human, very much like, as in, nothing against aliens in the Star Wars universe, but, human in the real world. You feel like you could connect to her because she's not perfect. And I really, really like that element. So I'm hoping that Cataclysm will kind of balance that a lot more. I think on the cover of Cataclysm is actually Axel Greylark as well, and he seems to be holding Gela Natai's lightsaber, which is a very interesting thing too. So I'm definitely excited about Phase 2. I'm really enjoying it so far. I thought Convergence was absolutely fantastic, and Path of Deceit was phenomenal. So really excited to see where it kind of goes from here. But that was one of my only sort of criticisms, is that I could kind of tell when certain characters were going to die in Battle of Jedha because they didn't appear elsewhere. So I was like, well, are they going to introduce a new character in this audio drama, or are they going to kind of loop it where he starts and ends in this audio drama, thinking of Keth Serapath. So I think those are the majority of my thoughts of this kind of where we are at the moment. This is like the halfway point of Phase 2. This is like between Wave 1 and Wave 2. And then obviously coming up, we've got Cataclysm, Quest for Planet X, and Path of Vengeance. And then also there's the comics I'm going to be tackling soon, including the Blade miniseries, the 10 High Republic comics by Marvel, the, I assume either 6 or 8 High Republic Adventures comics by Dark Horse, written by Daniel Jose Older. There's the Quest for the Jedi one-shot by Claudia Gray as well, which is a comic. I think there's something else that I'm missing, but I can't remember off the top of my head what it is. There will also be the stories as well that are in Star Wars Insider. I'm hoping they release those as a collection like they did with Starlight Stories. I really hope they do, because I don't want to have to buy individual back issues of Star Wars Insider, because that will be costly. I'd rather just buy a nice hardback collection of these short stories, but we shall see in that regard, because there's going to be even less of those than there are with Starlight, and the Starlight one was quite thin as well. But anyway, so I want to just go through the general plot in a little bit more detail, and then I'll start to wrap up. So these are all my thoughts and things. I've obviously given some spoilers, but here is a general idea of what happens in this audio drama. So as I said, representatives from ARAM and Aerono went to Jeddah to sign a treaty which would confirm the peace negotiations and things, and then the Forever War would officially be over. So that happens while the Festival of Balance is happening during the Season of Light, and certain other elements as well. The Path of the Open Hand are there, and they are causing a bit of disruption, shall we say. The Herald is riling up lots of people in the crowd and stuff, because they want to try and join the conflagration of the Force, because they want to be taken seriously among other Force religions, but obviously the Path of the Open Hand aren't, because a lot of what the Path of the Open Hand say is that when you use the Force, as I said earlier in this review, use the Force, it takes it away from someone else. But all the Jedi, whenever they're confronted by that idea, they go, well, do you have any evidence of that? Do you have any proof? Because that's completely unfounded and doesn't make any sense. And they go, well, that's your perception of the Force. So people who interact with the Path of the Open Hand become quite jaded by some of their ideas, and they are quite rude about people who use the Force. And some of them, especially the younger members, seem to be quite malicious against the Jedi, like being very rude to them when they walk past and shouting obscenities and things like that. So this is all going on while this peace treaty is starting to get signed. Then a droid bombs it, and that is caused by basically a dark side group, which are the Brothers of the Ninth Door. And so they turn out to be paid by Tilson Graff, who wants to cause some more disruption, because I think it's that he makes more money by selling droids to Aerono and ARAM, and he had some other military stuff involved. So he was trying to sell things to the warring factions because he would make loads of money if the war continues, if this forever war continues. Whereas obviously most people want this forever war to end. Not everyone though. So that's going on, and the Jedi are just trying to constantly firefight. They're trying to work out how this bomb went off, who caused it, trying to work out if the Path of the Open Hand are involved in some way, trying to basically unravel a mystery as it's happening, and trying to firefight, literally and figuratively, while trying to save people from like certain death. And then also the Path of the Open Hand have the Leveler with them, so that creature that feeds on Force energy and calcifies people, aka turning them to stone, like what happened with Loden Greatstorm, what happened to Kevmo, what's happened to a fair few Jedi now in the High Republic era. So that's going on, the riots are starting and everything goes a bit mental and things. The Path of the Open Hand are trying to help people and trying to give safe refuge to people while all this rioting is going on, so they seem really good in the public eye, and a lot of members of the Path of the Open Hand are actually trying to be good people. So that happens while Keth Serapath is going around also trying to work out what's happening. He's communicating with Salandra Show, who she was there because she was doing like a pilgrimage to try and find herself and find a little bit of peace in some ways, but she kind of gets roped into doing this thing unofficially, trying to like investigate while Creighton Sun and Ada Forte are officially actually investigating and things. So you've got all these threads going around, lots of characters interacting with each other that I find interesting. I find that the Enlightenment scenes are kind of boring. I'm just not that excited. It might be because, nothing against any of the voice actors in this, they did a great job making the voice of Craydon, the owner of the Enlightenment bar, but his voice is so annoying. It just cuts through me like a knife. So whenever he talks, I'm just like, oh God. And you've got whole scenes in this Enlightenment bar, and I found those elements a little bit weaker. I found that was the least exciting part of the book itself. But as I said, then war starts to go on. Erano and Aram end up really fighting. They deploy ground troops who are like fighting in the streets of Jedha, which is destroying a lot of people's homes, a lot of like important religious buildings. You've got members of the Guardians of the Wills and other people trying to fend off Erano and Aram while trying not to kill them all as well, trying not to escalate the war. It's very hard to fight a battle while trying to de-escalate a war. That's happening while the Leveler's going around and making all the Jedi and Force users unbalanced and actually killing quite a few of them as well, but no one has any idea what's going on. So they keep thinking it's the path of the open hand. They keep going there, but there's no evidence. There's just a few feelings here and there, but they don't want to poke the path of the open hand too much because then it seems like harassment. So it's really on this tightrope in a sense, while these Brothers of the Ninth Door are causing a lot of havoc. They're the ones that bombed things. They're ones that are like doing a lot of things, like that are causing a lot more disruption. They are followers of the dark side of the Force. I was hoping we'd get a Force sect who do follow the dark side of the Force, who aren't just evil. We don't have that yet, unfortunately. We've kind of got, I suppose the Night Sisters of Dathomir are somewhat like that, but they use like dark side magic, which is slightly different. And, Asajj Ventress was an antagonist for a long period of time, and then towards the end of the Clone Wars, she kind of became a little bit less of an antagonist and more of like a, air quotes, good figure. You got Mother Talzin, who's kind of neutral and stuff. So it's odd, but I would like to see the dark side of the Force explored a lot more with people who aren't just inherently evil, who don't just want to kill people for the fun of it. I know that's kind of part and parcel with what the dark side of the Force ends up pushing you to do, but I would really like that element kind of explored a bit more. So there's fights that are going on. As I said, the Great Protector falls. Many of the Guardians of the Wills get killed. There's other sort of smaller Jedi that I think get killed as well, but there's not actually that many Jedi there. Tilson Graf gets killed by the Mother. There's like loads of shooting each other in the back and things like that. Lots and lots of death that can be attributed to the war after the fact. Fortunately, the forces managed to get stopped by Creighton's son, Ada Forte, and some of the Guardians. They managed to stop it, but also they get reinforcements from the Republic because they managed to send out a transmission, and the Republic Jedi come down and manage to make it to Jedha and stop a lot more things. Then Creighton's son gives out this big speech and things, trying to tell the people of Aram and Arano to not fight each other anymore, which does make a lot of the soldiers stop fighting, but then one of the Jedi do say, you did a great thing there. But unfortunately, a lot of those soldiers are probably going to get court-martialed now because they didn't follow a direct order. So there is a bit of darkness. It's a war, there's a battle going on, but it is quite some dark moments where you go, oh, that was really nice. And then one chapter later, you're like, oh, that's not quite as nice then, is it? And then you've got Keth Serapath. So the whole time he's trying to like make a story for himself in some ways. He's trying to do the best that he can, but he's always talking about these stories of these amazing people doing these amazing things. And he does get an amazing story about him, which is quite, it touches you in the heart, even though he obviously dies. But he saves Solandra Sho's life. She fights with one of the Brothers of the Ninth Door. She is winning and stuff like that, but then it's usual dark side trickery and stuff. And then she gets into a compromised position. Keth saves her, but in doing so, the Brother of the Ninth Door does manage to kill Keth, and therefore Syl kind of feels that weight on her quite a lot of like, Keth died for her, so she feels an obligation to go to Enlightenment and tell his friends about all the stuff he did and wants to tell his story, which is really, really nice. But this book doesn't end on a high by any stretch of the imagination. It does end on a bit of a low because, the Jedi feel like they failed because they didn't stop this battle going on. The peace treaty still hasn't been signed. They feel like they're kind of back to square one again, and that they failed Fantu and Ziri of the Erano and Aram legacy, basically the people from Convergence who married to then stop the warring worlds from fighting each other so much. So this is quite like it's a big moment, I think, in Phase 2. It's a very important moment in Phase 2, and it all kind of feeds together into the last 3 books of Phase 2, because obviously Phase 2 is only going to be 2 waves as opposed to Phase 1 was 3 waves. But that is generally what happens, and then it kind of ends with some of the troops being pulled out of Jedha. Things like the dust has settled in a way. There's been a lot of property damage, a lot of people killed. The Path of the Open Hand have kind of bailed and go off to Dalna to regroup and hide, essentially. And that's where like a lot of their people are, and that's where Path of Deceit occurred, and then that's where Path of Vengeance is going to happen as well. So very excited about those things. and then the Jedi are starting more and more to suspect the path of the open hand. Salandra didn't come into contact with one of the Nameless, but she didn't die from it. She didn't get calcified, but she started to have the hallucinations and panicking and like feeling like the air's being sucked out of her. But then the Nameless, I think, got like distracted, or someone managed to save her or something without realizing that she was in true danger. And then she felt that feeling, and then when she went and spoke to the mother after the fact, she felt that feeling around the mother as well. Not quite the same, but a much more diluted amount. So she is very suspect of the path of the open hand and the mother herself. But yeah, the last part of the book is, as I said, Salandra Show telling Keth Sarapath's friends about his story and the importance of what he did in this whole Battle of Jedha and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that was a really rambly run through of the plot. As I say, I always recommend people pick up either the script book or listen to the audio drama itself. It's really, really well put together, both in writing and also in performance. Really did enjoy it. I'd say that if you were a little bit put off by the Tempest Runner, this is definitely a step above. Once again, nothing against Cavan Scott or any of the people who were involved in making the Tempest Runner. I just feel like the Tempest Runner was quite inconsequential. It just felt like a bonus bit of content as opposed to a must-read, whereas the Battle of Jedha, although no major characters specifically died, the events that occurred in this audio drama are very important for Phase 2. And to be fair to the whole of the Star Wars universe, it explains how the Great Protector fell, and it kind of gives a bit more weight to the holy city of Jeddah and what has really been going on there sort of for hundreds of years. So really, really enjoyed that element. But I think that's pretty much where I'll start to wrap this up. So friends, thank you so much for listening as always. Please tell me what you thought of the Battle of Jedha and what you've been thinking about the High Republic so far. And I'd love to open up a dialogue. I love talking about Star Wars, obviously, and I obviously love talking about the High Republic. It's one of my favourite things in Star Wars at the moment, and the more content they get, I just get so excited. I'm on the last chapter of Battle Scars, which is the book set between Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor. I'm right at the end of that, which means I can start Cataclysm soon, so I'm very excited about that. I will do a review for Battle Scars. I think I'll end up releasing that shortly after the game Jedi Survivor comes out, so I think that comes out April 27th. So I may release it the week after that, so there may be another book review coming your way in a week or two. Next week, I think I'm going to do the Han Solo and Chewbacca comics to get that kind of wrapped up, and I know that links in with the upcoming Dark Droids crossover event that's going to be happening because Hidden Empire is now over. So I think that it's going to be Han and Chewie for next week. Then it will be probably the Battle Scars review. Then it will be the first batch of the High Republic comics, so issues 1 to 5, which will be the Phase 2 High Republic comics. I want to clarify that, so that will link in with all of the stuff that I've just been talking about in this and in the prior book reviews that I have done. Then I think is going to be kind of a bit of back and forth, so there'll be some stuff to do with the Hidden Empire crossover event, because I've still got 2 more episodes of that to release, I believe. And then there's also the other comics, like there's the Yoda comics. The 5th issue of that was released recently. Then in June, which I know is several weeks away, but in June we've got the Return of the Jedi 40th anniversary, and there's some comics I've received which are related to that. So you've got Ewoks, Jabba's Palace, Lando, Empire, Rebellion, Max Rebo, and I think there's going to be 1 or 2 more. I won't be tackling all of those in June because they're not all out yet. At the moment, Jabba's Palace is out, as is Ewoks, and I think another one's getting delivered to me before June as well. So I think I'll do a handful of them, and then once all the others get received, probably in the later part of 2023, then I'll do the rest of the Return of the Jedi 40th anniversary stuff. But that's generally what you can expect going forward. As I said, I'll try and do it so like a week on and a week off for High Republic, because certain people aren't as excited by the High Republic as me and don't want to hear just constant High Republic content. So I'm trying to do High Republic on next week, not High Republic, etc., etc. But obviously with Jedi Survivor coming out, I want Battle Scars to kind of, my review of that to kind of link in with that somewhat. And then obviously there's going to be more book reviews coming as I get through the High Republic books, while also I'm trying to do the comics for the High Republic, while I'm also trying to do the comics that are to do with the crossover events. And then there's also the comics that have got nothing to do with the crossover events. So I've got my work cut out for me, but it's okay because I love consuming all of this amazing Star Wars content. So how can you support the show? Well, you can support it by following me on social media at Genuine Chit-Chat. You can follow on YouTube, youtube.com/Genuine Chit-Chat. That's got all of my Star Wars Comics and Canon episodes in playlists, all of my Genuine Chit-Chat episodes there. We've just finished the Mandalorian discussion shows. So obviously Mandalorian finished a couple days back, and we've had every week myself and a group of guests talking about each episode. So all of those are up with video on YouTube right now as well, plus all the Star Wars Comics and Canon episodes in genre playlist, and all the Genuine Chit-Chat episodes in genre playlist, and a lot of the Genuine Chit-Chat episodes have video as well, so it's a great place to start there. You can also support the show by giving reviews and things. So you can give a rating on Spotify, which only takes like a couple seconds. So I'd really appreciate you doing that. Then there's also leaving reviews on Apple Podcasts, on Good Pods, on loads of different places. Wherever you listen, there's normally some sort of way to review or rate. So I'd really, really appreciate that. You can share on social media. You can tell your friends about it. Obviously tell them that they never have to have picked up a Star Wars comic or book in their entire lives. We try and get more people on the Star Wars Comics and Canon train. I know more and more of you are flooding in, and I really appreciate that. But the more the merrier. Further to that, you can subscribe to the Pop Culture Collective. A link is in the description, where it's a weekly newsletter where you will be kept up to date with everything that I've got going on with Comics and Canon, guest spots, and genuine chit-chat, plus loads of other incredible creators like Spider-Dan and the Secret Boars, like the Femon Collective, like the VHS Strikes Back, and then there's other contributors who put stuff in there when they've got stuff coming out. So myself, Spider-Dan, Femon, and I think VHS Strikes Back, we all have stuff coming out basically every week, so we're always in there. And then you've got people like Seth Singleton and Stevie J. Ray, who've got stuff coming out sort of either on a fortnightly basis or a monthly basis. You've also got Tony Farina, who is incredible. He's got Indie Comic Spotlight, so he talks about that. And he also has got a book coming out in a month or so too. Loads and loads of great content creators. And it's a brilliant way to keep up to date with what we're doing without having to follow us all on social media and keep up to date with all these things. You just get one email once a week with a little overview of what we're all up to. So it's really, really cool. And the newsletter isn't like massive or anything. We each only have like 100 to 200 words. So it's quite condensed in a good way. So it's a really, really easy way to keep up to date. Would hugely recommend people check that out. And obviously shout out to Super Dummy Paul, because he is the person who put together the Pop Culture Collective. So big shout out to him. Now, the only other ways you can support the show is by listening to loads of back episodes, so you can obviously go back through the feed of Comics in Motion and listen, or on YouTube, or on the feed of Star Wars Comics in Canon. Any of those ways you can go back and listen to those episodes, but also you can listen to my coverage of Star Wars Celebration that I did with Megan. It was a brilliant time, 4 days of just pure Star Wars bliss. We had an absolutely amazing time, and you can check out our 3 episodes, which go over all 4 of the days of what we were up to, some of the news that we heard, our opinions of that. And if you just want to hear about what a convention experience really is, and some recommendations if you're planning on going to a Comic-Con or one of the future Star Wars celebrations or anything like that, please check that out. They're a lot of fun to record, and me and Megan had an absolute blast at Star Wars Celebration, so that was great fun too. And the final way you can support the show is by going to patreon.com/genuinechitchat. For as little as £1 a month, you get access to hours and hours of additional content. There's over 170 episodes of Afterthoughts on there. Some of them are myself doing Star Wars Legends book reviews, but the majority of them are myself and Megan reviewing stuff. So we review movies, we review TV shows, live performances like Book of Mormon or the Bake Off musical or the SpongeBob musical, lots of musicals and things, or just like when we go on trips and stuff. A recent one we did is we gave our proposal/engagement story, because myself and Megan got engaged recently. Obviously, I proposed to her last week, and so we released that on Patreon. And then after a few days, I put it on the main feed for everyone to enjoy, because it was just such a busy week. I didn't have time to edit a normal episode. But yeah, Patreon has got early access to a lot of stuff, and a lot of behind the scenes things that you may not be able to see anywhere else, and a lot of stuff people like listening because of Megan. Like, if you want to hear more from Megan, go to patreon.com/genuinechitchat. As I said, it's only £1 a month, okay? It costs less money per month for my Patreon to get all the audio content that exists than it does for booking fees when booking basically anything. Going to the cinema, booking fees on that are normally about 99p, so it costs you 1 penny more to have hours and hours of additional content over there on Patreon and support the show than it does for the pithy booking fee that you have to pay when you book a lot of stuff. I mean, events, I've paid for tickets recently for something for Megan's birthday, and the booking fees on that were like £6 or £7 per ticket, which will get you over half a year of subscription to my Patreon. So please consider checking that out. You get an episode every week, and on certain weeks you get 2 episodes as well, and early access to stuff, and a few other bits and pieces. But friends, thank you so much for supporting the show. As always, I appreciate each and every one of you listening and sharing and supporting in all the amazing ways that you do. I will speak to you next week with, what did I say I was going to do? Han Solo and Chewbacca issues 6 to 10. So if you haven't listened to my issues 1 to 5, go back and listen to that, because I give you all the plot details and the relevant connections. I think that was released in sort of October, November time. I think it was sort of late 2023. And, then after that will be the Battle Scars review, and after that will be delving back into the High Republic comics. So just thank you, friends. I appreciate you hugely. I'll speak to you next week, and as always, may the Force be with you. The intro for Star Wars Comics and Canon is arranged by myself, Mike Burton, and the backing music was made by Eric Matias of soundimage.org.
You have just experienced host, creator, everything elser of Genuine Chit-Chat, and also the host and creator of Star Wars Comics and Canon, found on the Comics in Motion podcast, Mike Burton.